Joining me in the studio today are two of my favorite people to have important, meaningful conversations with.
Thanks, Ryan.
Jordan Victoria Lewis, here to my immediate right. Jordan is the associate pastor at New Life Friday Night. I just found out that you had a title change right before we started this.
Well, you and me both.
Oh.
So
Good. Thank you,
I'm
HR.
finding out right now, so
helping
I'm
us out.
very happy about
Associate
this.
pastor.
well, we'll see what happens.
Oh, okay, cool. TBD. And then right beyond her is Christina Hoagland, the pastor of women's ministries here at New Life Church. Thank y'all for joining me today.
Of course. Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
To
thanks,
talk about all things preaching, but to talk in as honest and transparent and helpful of a way as we can about what it means to be like women who are developing the craft of preaching and all of the conversations that flow out of such a thing. So I think a good place to start is either of you can fire back first. Did you grow up in contexts or come to faith in contexts where women preaching was a norm, or was it a barred off thing? So Jordan, I'll throw it to you first.
Yeah, it's I'll kind of tee this up. We come from the extreme opposites,
I know.
Christina.
We're
and
the
I.
right people for
Yes,
this conversation.
yeah, for sure. So the first 3 pastors I ever had were all women, and they all preached. So for me, it was very normal to see women in the pulpit.
Okay.
Women have the title of pastor, women preaching. That was something that I grew up with. My mom is a brilliant teacher, so I was used to seeing her, be in the pulpit, teaching, doing different things. So for me, it was very normal.
Typical. But for Christina, different experience.
Yeah, very different. Yeah, I grew up in a denomination that didn't affirm women in pastoral positions, really not even in leadership. I was just thinking the other day about how really the first strong female leadership I saw was when I went to college and had women leading worship. And obviously that's not even directly preaching, but I feel like it can be a form of it.
It's a platformed leadership role of some sort.
Exactly. And how impacted I was by that, but I didn't necessarily have the words of why it was so impactful at the time. And then really I didn't talk and meet in person the first female pastor till I came here.
So I'm curious then, did you grow up your whole life, did you have this assumption in the back of your mind that women in role like pastoral leadership or preaching roles was right or wrong? Did you have that paradigm, or was it just, I've never seen it, so it's just not a thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for most of my upbringing, it was just not a thing. And then when I got into high school and college, because I went to a Christian school, then I developed more of a theology that it was borderline heretical, I would say.
That's were a heretic?
No, the topic.
Tell us more about you being a heretic.
No, the top, women being in pastoral leadership was pretty much on the borderline of being heretical.
Oh, okay. So
just straight up not what it is accurately, the scriptural position on it would be against women in leadership.
It's so interesting. So you then find yourself in college, and that's where you start to wrestle with some of these things or put these ideas together. I came to faith as a 16-year-old kid in a Foursquare Pentecostal church.
Oh yeah.
I didn't know that that there was even a conversation to be had about women preaching, pastoring, leading, doing anything until I got to Bible college.
Huh.
So it isn't until, and believe it or not, I was trying to figure out when the moment was. It wasn't until I was sitting in a hermeneutics class in undergrad with a female professor that I realized that women preaching was not a norm. And she was on the edge of it. She was like, yeah, women don't preach.
Wow.
So for her, she was like, I'm teaching a class. It's not the same thing. I'm allowed to do this. And I was like, I had, a youth pastor who was a woman who helped who probably called faith out of me more than anyone else did. She was a little scary, so that's probably where most of the faith came from. I was like, if you say so.
Oh my God.
But I didn't know until I got deeper into Christian institutions that wasn't a typical thing. So Jordan, you growing up with it as a norm, do you feel like, maybe this is a better question to ask, when did you start to feel like maybe preaching is a part of your like gift set and calling? Was it when you were younger? Did it happen later in life? When did it show up?
The first sermon I ever preached, I was 12 or 13.
Okay.
And
was it
so
good?
it was probably terrible. But I preached on 1 Corinthians 12. So, just
I
classic.
love that you know that. That's so good.
Yeah, for sure. And so, but even then, I didn't realize I had a call to preach. It was just my youth pastor said, "Hey, Jordan, you are a person of faith. You know the word. And this is something that I want to invite you to do."
Just do it.
But he didn't say you're called to preach. It was just, hey, like you're a 12-year-old kid. You should preach a sermon, right? Kind of a thing. And then I'm a poet. So as a teenager, I did a lot on stage. So I was used to being in front of people, but still not thinking, oh, this is something I should do. Even though people kept affirming me, I kept being invited to do things, I didn't connect the dots. And that's because I had a passion other than ministry. So for me, I wasn't really interested in doing anything in a ministry context. So I didn't really care that much if I was going to preach or do anything like that.
Yeah. So as a 12-year-old, were you reading that moment as like, this is an initiation into calling, or are you it's just a random event?
Yeah.
So when do you have the moment, maybe, and calling can be a convoluted word, but when do you have the moment that maybe you start to think, oh, preaching, this might be a part of what I give my life to?
Yeah. I have a business background. So I was in the middle of my corporate MBA. I've made it to a fancy financial company life. And in the middle of a work day, the Lord said, "Hey, what are you doing?" I'm like, "I'm working, thank you."
Please leave me alone.
Right, yeah.
I know what happens when you show up in the middle of a day talking.
I'm like, I don't want that. I don't want these shenanigans. But he said, "Hey, I've given you the type of mind where you can quit what you're doing today, go and be a rocket scientist if you want it to be. But what am I actually breathing life on?" And I stopped what I was doing and I thought about it. And I said, I can't go anywhere. I was in my mid-20s at this time. I said, I can't go anywhere without being put on stage or being asked to lead. And he said, yep, tuck that in the back of your mind.
Wow.
And so that was kind of the first conversation I had with anyone really about, hey, this path that you're on, maybe there's something other for you, and maybe it has something to do with stage. So it was the Lord kind of saying, these events aren't so random, and there's a pattern that I have. So I, ignored him as a good Christian does.
Yes. You got to the first time.
Yeah, right, for sure. But at the time I was living in Utah and I was leading a young adults ministry.
Okay.
And so I was preaching often, leading Bible studies, that type of a thing. But it wasn't until moving back here to Colorado, I'm from here, left, came back, moving back to Colorado where the Lord called me into ministry. And I've been swept up into this whole life.
So I'm asking this question on purpose because I want to come to Christina in a second. So when you have the moments though where where God is saying, hey, it might be on a platform, it might be leading, it might be using your voice, because of the upbringing you had, none of that is a red flag to you.
No.
You're like, yeah, that seems like it could be reasonable.
Yep.
It could be on the table.
Yep.
Christina, same question to you.
Yeah.
When do you start to have the moment where you're like, I think I should preach. I think this is a part of how God has gifted me. When does that moment come for you?
It's fairly recent.
Okay. So
say.
what time? So like 10 a.m.?
Yeah, like
okay.
pretty recent. Yeah, I think the quickest way to answer that is when we came here and I had done a lot of work theologically for the Lord to be like, this is what I really say. And how do we take off the previous incorrect theological lens and put on the right one that is founded in Scripture, not because of culture or influence or whatever.
Can I ask before you go
Yes.
on? What were some of the like voices and resources that you tapped into that helped shape a new perspective?
Yeah. Lucy Pepiat's book, Rediscovering Scripture's Vision of Women, which is all about the most disputed texts on the topic, has been incredibly helpful. Beth Allison Barr's The Making of Biblical Womanhood. Philip Payne's The Bible versus Biblical Womanhood, and then a lot of conversation and a lot of diving into the word on my own.
I'm curious. I've talked with women who have, similar space, come from a space where them preaching or leading or pastoring off the table, and they discover resources like that. And I've had I've had women tell me that it feels like, they're like hiding paraphernalia while they're reading those books because like
Yikes.
if anyone knew that they were like stumbling, like they were reading that, they would be criticized. They'd be told, "Oh, you're liberalizing the Bible now," or whatever. Did you feel any of that awkwardness of like, I'm digging into this, my mind is starting to change. Can I even talk to people about this anymore? Or was so much of that happening here at New Life that has a context that affirms it that you felt like you could just talk about it wide open?
Yeah, that's good. I would say it was kind of both. Like I started the journey before we got here and I kind of did feel like that. And I think what's tricky is when you're coming from the perspective of women can't do it. There's so many resources, just period, that like I had no one really to ask, is this, doctrinally sound? Should I start with this one? Or am I going to just, jump into a book that is like super not what I believe and then be even more confused? But it was through, on Essential Church, they interviewed Lucy Pepiat. And so that's where I had that reference. And then, so I think the best courses like recommendations from people that you trust, right, is a great place to start. But it is true that like when I started ordering books and started the journey, there were books on the shelves, and I could think of them right now, where I was like, that title scares me to death. And I don't think I'm there yet. So, so starting with ones that I was like, okay, this is going to tackle specifically the theology. This is going to tackle the history. Nijay Gupta's book, Tell Her Story, is incredibly important because it tackles women in the Bible and the cultural time of the scriptures, things like that. And then I think it's really important to just be sensitive to where you are because of that. It's like, don't be hindered because it feels like this is pushing ground that feels like normative where I'm at. But also be wise, and do your research on people because there's a bunch of people that have recommended me things. And I'm like, I look up that person. I'm like, oh, we don't even land on most of the theological things. So I'll just dismiss that one, But it is true that it's a bit scary. I think that's how you described it is true. Like the scariness of, because we have the polarized version of highly, highly complementarian, women can't do anything, all the way to very, very feminist, and we're, putting down men in order to lift women up. There's just an assumption when you start even a little bit that you're going to land all the way over here.
Right.
And so it's kind of like, well, you have to trust me that I'm going to honor this journey well and just like be there with me for it,
So I interrupted you to ask that question.
No, that's a good
talking about
question.
your experience of finding like, I feel like I'm called to preach. That's a recent experience. But what were some of the were there markers for you that made you feel like, oh, this is a gift I have, I need to use? It would actually be a detriment to me to not use it. What were some of those moments?
Yeah, similar to Jordan, a lot of it was rooted in leadership, like in college, in other spaces, just stepping into leadership roles and that being affirmed. There was never a question in my mind that would be something I needed to do. But the Lord clarified it first by like a shepherding gifting. And really I view that as my forbearing gift is shepherding. That's the primary thing that I feel like God is calling me into as a pastor is the shepherding space. So when that got affirmed last year, then I really asked the Lord, like, when I think about the leadership gifting you've given me, and because I'm so like research oriented and I love studying the Word of God and I love talking about it with people, like help me see if preaching could be a thing.
Sure.
So for me, it was like, yes, pastorally that's affirmed, shepherding it's affirmed. So is preaching a space where I'm also going to do that? And just laying that before the Lord and asking that question.
Oh, so what I love this because I would imagine there are people who will listen to this who will be in the headspace that you all were in 3 to 5 years ago, where you're feeling like there's this tug, this thing towards it, but there's maybe what are perceived as barriers or whatever. But I love what you did, which is, I think it might be a thing. So I'm just going to ask God if it is a thing. What both of you speak to this, what would be some encouragement to the women, the girls who are listening to this, who are going, I feel like I want to preach. I want to do this, but I don't even know, like, research, all that stuff is great. But what would you say to them, like, how to pray about that?
Yeah. I'll say, even though I grew up with this being normal, and when the Lord first started talking to me, it wasn't a red flag. As I had to actually enter into it, being on staff here at New Life, that's when I felt a bit fearful and challenged because I knew for the first time I'm in a place where not everyone thinks I can do this, and I didn't have a way to defend myself. So initially, I was kind of pulling back a little bit, and I remember the Lord woke me up in the middle of the night, just I shot straight up out of bed. And the verse I thought of, I can't call it to mind now, but it says, if anyone has a gift, they should use it. And so the Lord spoke to me and said, you have a gift. It's been affirmed by everyone you know, and you have a responsibility to the body to use it. So I would tell I don't know what camera I need to look at, but any women or girls.
Any others, 15.
Yes,
in here,
just
whatever.
one of these. But if you have a gift, you have to use it. You have a responsibility to the body to use your gift. The other thing I had to sort through was, when it comes to preaching, it's such a robust topic, and there are lots of ways to think about it. And at the risk of oversimplifying it, it's proclaiming the good news.
Right.
And every believer has a responsibility to do that, whether it's to one person or whether it's to thousands of people. And so I think we kind of get really complex about, can women do this or can they not? But for me, I had to simplify it and say, I have a gift and I have a responsibility to use it. And even I had to go as far to say, to those who know what is right and don't do it, to them it is sin. So for me, I had to kind of be extreme with myself. But also I'm a believer and I have a responsibility and a joy to proclaim the goodness of God. So for me, it just was as simple as that.
That's good. Christina, anything you'd add to that?
So good, Jordan. Well, Jordan and I have had many conversations because we got prayed in at the same time, and it's been really sweet to share the journey together. And it has been interesting how both of us have had different wrestles, because I think I did so much work before on the theology end to get to the place I was, that there was like a soundness I knew from Scripture that if this is what God is calling me to, I felt more of a defense. Whereas because you saw it, it's like in there, but also that's what we've talked about a lot, is like, how do I defend this theologically so that when those things come? And on the flip side, Jordan has such an incredible like innate gift of communicating and sharing the word in a way that feels so approachable, tackling things that are truth bombs, but handing them to people in such a beautiful way that like they can take it, and that's new for me. That's newer territory of like being an organic communicator. So I'm learning from her in the wealth of having that like confidence from seeing it done before. And I'm looking at people now to do the same. So I would say my encouragement is we really have to like rally around each other to, push through the awkward moments of like, I'm doing this for the first time and I don't really know how it's going to go.
Yeah.
To, hey, you've been doing this a while, but maybe nobody's ever kind of invested into you in this topic.
Sure.
So how can we go a little deeper, like more robust theology, more, or whether it is in the craft of actually how you deliver your sermons, whatever it may be. But I don't know that I could be sitting here if I didn't have people around me. I mean, I know I couldn't really.
Yeah, one of the questions that we've talked about on here with guests a lot is the idea of like finding and discovering your voice and what it is. And Jordan, you and I have had some conversations around that. I didn't tell you guys that we were going to talk about this, but here we are.
Yeah, I love this topic, so let's go.
I'm curious though, for you, Jordan, someone who had like performance experience but was like stepping into a different space, and you, Christina, who had like this, honestly, just a blank slate of like, when I get up on a platform, what do I sound like? How have you guys gone about finding your voice or discovering what does Jordan and Christina sound like when they preach? How have you gone about figuring that out?
Yeah, it's actually been a very tricky transition for me, because For me, there are going to be poetic elements to how I preach, but preaching is not poetry.
Sure.
So for me, even when I'm writing a sermon, I can't just go on, oh, I have a great image and this is how I feel inside and that's it. It's like, okay, great. But like, it's a sermon. So what does the Bible say?
Sure.
And you should talk about that. Right. And so for me, it's been interesting to have to kind of go back to basics and say what made me effective as a poet and how can I translate that into my preaching. And for me, what people have always said about my poetry is how authentic it is and also how it helps them connect further to themselves. So for me, I've been able to kind of think creatively, okay, that's my unique gift set as a poet. Now, as a preacher, how can I connect people to the word? How can I be authentic to, hey, I know that a life of faith can be difficult sometimes, but here's how we go forward in strength. And so it's been making something more robust for me. Yeah.
What I hear you saying to create, to like broaden it a little bit is you had like a field that you had clear gifting and talent and skill in. And it sounds like what you're saying is what you did was kind of went, okay, if I'm good in these ways at this, can I duplicate that? Can I be good in those same ways at this? I think that's really practical because I think as men or women who find themselves early on in preaching are often just doing this like, I don't even know where to start. I don't know. So they end up sounding like a bunch of other people or trying to do a bunch of other things. I think it's a really good tactic to say, take the things that you know you're good at in other communicating spaces and try to just replicate it in a different way over here. Christina, what about you finding your voice? What was that process like? Or what is it like? Because we're all still trying to figure this out.
Right. Sure. And I do think that's like a key part of the conversation is part of it is there's I feel like there has been a historic pressure sort of sounding a certain way in the pulpit. You know, you think of like historically, you know, fire and brimstone preachers to, depending on the denomination, like it kind of looks like this versus this versus this. But I think we're in a time where it's so different. Like there's so many different voices. There's a lot more freedom, I think, to bring who you really are. 'Cause really, I think at the core of like how you use your voice has so much to do with how God has made you, what you're passionate about, and still bringing those things. And obviously, like you said, adapting it. But then on the flip side, it's, do I have equity with the people that I'm speaking to? Because if you do, you have a lot more freedom, I think, to just be who you are because they know you. And they're not necessarily like, it has to sound this way, or, you know, it'll be powerful because of the relationship you carry with them. But I do think, like, practically the best thing I've ever heard was when we heard John Tyson speak about finding your voice. And I think he just added this to the Art of Teaching class that you can do online. So I recommend that. But he mentioned like the things that he uses specifically. So he's like, I always include a woman in every sermon, some kind of reference, like a quote by a woman or a theologian. I always include the voice of a minority. I always include art. Those are like he had 8 like main things. But so when he started saying that, I was like, oh man, that's so practical. And he kind of said, what makes you cry? What makes you get angry? Like, these are the things that you carry a mantle for that not everybody will. And so therefore, if God gives you the grace to be in a pulpit and share a message, like you're saying, the responsibility is, it needs to be somehow in line with that mantle, I think, which is part of our voice. So for me, I know for sure that's historical things. So I always reference some crazy thing that happened, like in this lady. Right, exactly. And usually it's pretty like rough. So I'm like, how do I make this not totally make the room feel like myrrh?
Yeah. The Black Death. That's so great.
Right. But it's important because, you know, the learning history, it informs how we handle things today. And that is true. And that's true even scripturally, right? When we were like, why do we go back to the Old Testament to help us understand the New Testament? Why does Jesus and so many people in the New Testament quote the Old Testament? Because obviously it's the word of God, but it's relevant. It informs us to even today. So that would be an example of like, my journey has been, who am I talking to? Do I have the equity with them to fully be myself, or do I need to adapt that a bit? And then what are the things I carry specifically?
Yeah, that's so good. I think one of the things that's popping in my head right now as we're talking about this is, as younger preachers, both men and women, I think often the goal, like their sights get set on, once I get the chance to preach, everything will be gravy.
Oh my
then
God.
it's good, right? So like,
Gravy.
once I
Plot
get the
twist.
opportunity, then we'll be good. But I think you guys can both speak to this. Most opposition doesn't come until after you get the chance to preach.
Listen, that's the whole truth and nothing but the
Yep,
truth.
yep.
Right. Listen, I've never told a lie. That's not true. We just talked about people getting messed up because they say stuff on camera.
Oh my God.
Anyways, I think what happens though is the opposition comes the moment that first preaching rep is done.
Yes.
What's interesting about opposition, and I want to hear you guys speak to this, is there's the external opposition that you can face, but there's also like the internal opposition that you can
Man,
face. So, thoughts?
So many thoughts. I will say internal opposition is my biggest struggle, where I will finish preaching and I'll know that the Lord is pumped, the people are pumped, I can get great feedback, but I am destroying myself after a sermon. And it's one of those things where
Can I tap into your head for a second?
Yeah.
What is the destroying of Jordan sound like?
Oh my gosh. I mean, it depends on the day, but the consistent.
Let's say it's a Friday night around 8 o'clock.
Okay. So I if I can be really vulnerable.
Yeah.
So I
can be.
preached at Friday night a couple weeks ago. I finished my sermon. I turn to get off the stage. We have little stairs that I walk down the little stairs, and immediately that was terrible. Why are you even on stage at all? You should just not preach again. Like, that was stupid. You said this wrong. You shouldn't have said that. Like, immediately. I wasn't even back to my seat yet, and the thoughts already started. What I've had to come to terms with is I am my harshest critic. So it's not, the enemy is in my mind, not anywhere else. And so I've had to tell the Lord, okay, if this is what I'm called, not if, I am called to preach. And because of that, if I'm going to make it, I cannot have World War III every time I preach. What am I going to do? And so I've had to practice radical grace for myself. But I've also had to say, okay, if I'm hard to please, let me give myself some wins. So if I told this story, good job.
Oh, this is good.
If I talked about these two verses that I really wanted to talk about, good job. And then everything else, I set it aside. And so I've had to set up wins for myself, because it'd be really easy for me to nitpick and tear myself apart. But my brain can be very logical. So it's like, okay, if I'm in my feels, then that's not really a way for me to win or have any longevity as a preacher. But if I say, hey, I'm aiming for this one target and make it easy for myself, then that's how I've been able to kind of start building myself up.
Yeah, what really happened while I was up there?
Right.
What really happened? Not what do I think happened,
Yes.
or what do I feel happened,
Yeah.
but what
Right.
really happened. I said these three things. I said I wanted to say those three things.
Yep.
We can go home now.
Yes.
Okay, that's good. Christina, what about you?
That's really good. I'm curious about you first. I think it's
Yeah, we
What are
wanna
you
know,
important.
curious
Rory.
I think
about?
it's
What do you wanna
important
know?
to the conversation, because my head goes to, like, are there differences specifically, like, gender wise, that men and women fight because of the fact that so many of us as women haven't had, similar exposure. Like, you have, I don't know, 10, 15 years on us probably, right? 10?
Probably 8.
Okay.
We'll say 8.
Yeah, let's say 8. Right. So you don't feel too old.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So here's the truth. The inner critic doesn't exist a ton anymore. But my greatest wrestle is that I would walk off of a platform and not be understood as I meant it.
Wow.
So some of that's a personality thing. that's my greatest like challenge in interpersonal conflict or conversations as well too.
Oh, that's
is
good
like
insight.
if Jordan and I get into a disagreement, my greatest fear is that I would walk away from that conversation and Jordan would have misread what I was actually feeling my emotions about.
Sure.
Not like the real thing, which is like, whatever. I just want to solve this problem. I'm not mad at you. I'm not even thinking about you, to be totally honest. I'm just trying to solve this problem.
Right.
So I think my greatest fear is always, how does the room interpret me? I was so early on with preaching concerned that I would come across dumb or theologically like inept. So I've like fought to kind of clear that piece out. But my fear is always when I step off. So my worst nightmare is when someone comes up to me after preaching and says, hey, I don't really understand what you just said.
Oh, man.
And then I'm like, oh, man, I failed you. That's like what comes across in my head.
Wow.
I know that's not true. I didn't fail them. What I've found to be true about most like people when they're listening to a sermon, because this is true for me, is I catch one thing and I will completely miss 15 other things. So like what usually happens in those conversations, I find, is I'm having to clarify like, oh, you caught the one moment I said this, but then you missed the 3 things after it and you didn't really have the first thing before it. So you've got this one little nugget, but you don't have all the context.
Yeah.
Which makes for a great pastoral conversation. Let's
Right.
talk about like why you grabbed that or whatever. So I don't know. Maybe it's arrogance that I've been able to like kill the inner critic a little bit. My like deepest concern though, when I step off stage and I'll stand like at East and I'll stand on the front row and we're taking communion, is I'm always just going like, I hope I wasn't misunderstood.
Yeah.
Which we don't have time to talk about my childhood trauma and all that other stuff, but I would imagine it comes from someplace like that.
Sure.
Oh,
But-
yeah, I would think so. I mean,
Christina, enough about me. I asked you a question.
thanks for sharing that. That's
You're
good.
welcome.
That's good.
I should be laying on the couch is what it feels like is going on right now.
Switch spots real quick.
Yeah. Lay down and do therapy
Nice.
for a little
Oh
bit.
my gosh.
What kind of let's do this. What kind of external criticism have you received as someone who's like stepping into the preaching space, and how have you handled it?
This is a great question. So, I mean, in full transparency, I've preached 5 times ever. So,
Right?
at young adults, and I also do include what I do at women's ministry in the last like 4 months, also preaching. But I'm teaching a curriculum that's already been written, so it's like it feels a little different, more like the teaching space, because I'm translating her content into
Sure.
my voice. Yeah, I mean, I would say the top things that come to mind are, which I don't know if this, to be honest, I haven't gotten a ton of like external criticism.
Because you're just so good at
no,
preaching.
not
That
that.
must be nice.
No.
Yeah.
I think I think I'm kind of unique out of the 3 of us in this sense because I don't preach regularly. I've only preached in like the young adult space where it's a very specific audience that I do have a lot of equity with relationally. But as far as like asking for feedback or receiving feedback, most things are typically using and fillers, you
Sure.
know, because I'm I'm younger in this muscle, weaker in the muscle, I should say. See, and let's see. And then also, I think one of the things that I think we talked about this, Rory, with one of my sermons, but I have thought it as well, is the desire to get everything I have studied to the people because it all feels so good. And that's why Casey Fritz's, the first episode of this podcast was so good for me, Kill Your Darlings. I never heard that term, but the idea of like, they don't need it all. And I'm definitely similar, like it's in my interpersonal conversations. I can just be like, let me tell you everything. And I just see the glazing over of like, you probably didn't want to know the full history of everything. You probably just wanted the nugget, you know?
Right.
And so, yeah, I'm learning that piece of just how to narrow in on what do the people really need to hear? What is it that the Lord wants them to hear? Even though we all as preachers have to do the work on the back end of knowing as much as we can, right, to be equipped for what we're sharing. And
But that's pastoral. Like I think the great pastoral work of preaching is moving from I know a lot of things to what do these people need to know right now.
That's true.
And it's usually like an eighth of the stuff that we have like gathered in our heads. So I think that is what it means to be a pastor. This conversation I think has been really helpful, and I think it'll be helpful for people that are listening. A majority of the people that listen to this are people who preach, in a continual way. I'm wondering if you guys could, with these last couple minutes, like, what is one thing you would say to the lead pastor, the executive pastor, the teaching pastor that is sitting there going, how can I help like advance the women in our ministries that want to teach, that have that gift of preaching? What's like a word of encouragement or challenge or prophecy, if you want to get crazy, that you would extend to them? Yeah, I know who I'm sitting with here. What's a word of encouragement you would give to them?
Christina, I felt all of your words.
You could feel it all.
Yes.
I love you so much that you know that. It's all there. Yeah. Well, I just, to kind of set up what I'm about to say, I just want to tag on to, like, if there are people listening to this that don't preach on the regular, and because I feel that, and I mean, you're not an every week preacher either necessarily, but because it's so periodic for me, I do think a lot of the weight that we feel of like, you really got to have the home run this time, because what if you don't get asked again? You know, and it feels that way because it's like I don't have a determinative time of like when it will be next. So I'm really in faith, like growing and equipping in skill, right? Like it's to be like, all right, Lord, I'm asking God for opportunities and He's opening the doors, but I also feel the weight of I need to be ready. If He's like, here, go, do it. So I feel that with anybody that is in the same boat, and I do think there's just a being faithful and watching and being ready, not just being ready when you get asked, right? That's a reflection of the Lord knows the right time. Like the Lord knows it's not the only thing I'm doing. Shepherding is my main thing. So yeah, an encouragement in that space. But I will say, if I could encourage lead pastors or those who have a seat to equip women and to call them into the space. When we were at this conference that the three of us went to, there was this really significant moment that will stay with me for the rest of my life, where everybody's in a different context coming into that space. Like some are preaching a lot, some are like wondering what it is, what preaching is, do I have it? And there was a guy who stood up, and mostly it had been men asking questions, which I just paid attention to, the whole first day of the conference. The second day of the conference, there's a female speaker, and then now suddenly a lot more females feel the freedom to ask questions. But this gentleman stood up to ask the female leader a question. And he said this beautiful thing like, I've been preaching predominantly in our church, and I do believe I have a gifting for that and all that, And then he said, but... you remember this?
Yeah.
But my wife has an incredible gifting to preach. And he just said, it's her turn. And I just totally broke down. And that is like a mantra for me in the back of my mind of like, we need men and we need pastors to say, I get the pulpit 40 weeks out of the year, but it's her turn. And not only is it like, this is the time to bring women in and recognize, yes, women might be predominantly in the church 10, 20 years behind. So what are you going to do to proactively say, it's her turn. I want to give women the opportunity in my pulpit. They're not just going to show up. Like there's so few that are probably ready in the way that people expect them to be to hand them their pulpit. So am I proactively looking for women who are equipped to do it? Am I looking for the women in my church who might have that gifting? And what path do I have for them to get the reps, get equipped, do some courses, listen to people, whatever it might be. And then the most important thing is you give her the chance in the pulpit. And if she doesn't nail it, because it's the first time anybody's ever entrusted that to her, that you have the conversation, hey, here's what I want to work on. Here's what I saw that was great. Here's what I saw that was tough. In 6 weeks, you're going to get another chance. And we're going to keep building this, because the weight that women feel of, I get one shot.
Right.
I get one shot. And typically feedback culture is just so weak that it's left to us to be like, well, I guess I just totally ruined the whole opportunity.
Yeah.
And not just for me, but for any woman in my church that may want the same thing. And that's too much. Like, we need other people to lift the arms up and say, I want to join you in that, you know? So that's what I would say to those pastors.
That's excellent.
Jordan?
I love what you said about not just having a woman do it once, but giving her a path to do it again. That was amazing. I'm a strategist by nature, so I will keep this brief. But for me, if lead pastors, teaching pastors, executive pastors want to promote and support women preaching, you have to be mindful that that's a cultural shift, and you have to have a plan for how you're going to shift the culture. So it could be something like, oh, there are 2 women that I see this gifting on. I'm going to have each of them preach on this day at this time. I'm going to give them feedback. It can't just be, oh yeah, we should have women preach, so here they are. Like, you need to have a plan. And it doesn't have to be a super robust plan, but it does have to be thought out. I feel like when it comes to culture change in anything, people get idealistic, but they don't have any tracks. They don't have any pathway to create and maintain that change that they're seeking, and then it falls apart.
And there's often no way to measure if it's successful or not.
Right. And that's the other thing I would say, is to be thoughtful and really be prayerful about how you define success.
Yes.
So if you're defining success as, oh, I want this woman to be the female version of me,
Right.
you have already lost.
Come on.
Right? But if you want success to be, we need a woman in our pulpit, and once this woman gets up here, we are going to celebrate her. We are going to encourage her. We are going to have her back. We are going to make sure she knows how valuable this is. We are going to take care of her because this is a big deal. Then that's a win. So it's not just having a pathway, but also defining what the win is, and then working toward that win so that everyone wins. Like when women preach, the church wins.
That's right. Exactly.
That's a good word. Well, I just want to say to you two, thank you both for like stepping into the calling that God has placed on your lives. Thank you for not shying away from it. And thank you for being willing to talk about it. Because I know it's not an easy thing to just sort of air it out and talk about your inner critic and everything else. So thank you two for joining us.
Thank
this
you,
has been a
Rory.
gift. It'll be a gift to our listeners. And thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next time.